I've always tried to be a good parent, or at least, that's what I tell myself when the guilt creeps in, especially after the argument with my son, Noah, last weekend. It started innocently enough. We were hosting a family barbecue, the kind that used to be full of laughter and joy, but things changed when his cousin, Mia, came over. Mia, with her bright smile, effortless charm, and an ease with people that Noah has never quite managed to grasp, was a whirlwind of energy as she sauntered into our yard after a long drive from the city. Noah, my 10-year-old introvert, sat rigidly at the corner of our deck, poking at his plate of burgers like they had personally offended him. When Mia launched herself at her younger sister, Chloe, squealing with delight and engaging her with an uninhibited joy that only kids should possess, I couldn't help but notice Noah's sulking expression grow darker. The longer he watched Mia laugh and play, the more withdrawn he became. It was as if every giggle was a dagger buried deeper into his heart, and the way my daughter fawned over Mia cut like shards of broken glass. I couldn't ignore it. When the barbecue came to a close, and I noticed Mia stuffing her face with cake while Noah stared blankly into his soda, I felt a pang of frustration bubbling up within me, a vile mix of heartbreak and anger that begged to be unleashed. So, I did what I shouldn't have. I confronted him. "You know, it's your fault she's happier to see Mia than she is to see you," I blurted out, the words laced with a sting I instantly regretted. Noah's face fell, his eyes wide with a combination of hurt and confusion, like a kid who'd just been told there's no Santa. He looked at me with a depth of sadness I had never seen before, and in that moment, I realized I had crossed a line, but it was too late to take it back. I watched him wilt under the weight of my words, and my heart twisted painfully as I heard Mia exclaim how much she missed Chloe, how they should have playdates all summer long, as Noah quietly snuck away from the group, headed inside like a ghost. The rest of the day was a haze. Laughter echoed outside while I stared at my untouched food as guilt coiled around my insides. It felt like the summer buzz had died with my son's spirit, and I couldn't bear to face the implications of what I had done. I watched Noah pace the floor of our living room, his brows knitted in concentration as if he were solving an unsolvable puzzle. I knew I'd hurt him but couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, my harsh words were a push he needed to confront his own struggles with social interactions. Parenting is a turbulent sea. Sometimes, you have to risk capsizing in order to teach your child how to swim. But that little thought didn't diminish the weight pressing down on me, a hand squeezing painfully around my heart while I tried justifying my big mouth. I spent the night tossing and turning, his shocked face replaying in my mind, a haunting echo of regret that morphed into nightmares filled with shadows whispering secrets of my failures. By morning, I decided I needed to talk to him, get his side of the story, and construct a bridge over this chasm I had opened with careless words. I found him in his room, so small and fragile in the dim, gray sunlight filtering through his window. When I sat beside him, he looked up, eyes stormy with a mixture of sorrow and anger. I wanted to reach out and pull him into my embrace, but something kept me rooted in place, the ghost of my previous words acting as a barrier. "Mom, why did you say that?" he asked, his voice steady but breaking at the edges. I fumbled for the right words but found none. "I didn't mean, I just wanted you to see." But stopped, trailing off, feeling the futility of my attempts. "Are you mad at me?" he said, and that broke me. I felt the hot rush of tears stinging my eyes as I wrestled with an instinct to just sweep him up and yell at him to express himself, let anger out into the ether rather than bottle it up like he always does. Noah was my delicate boy, always so kind but often mocked at school for being too soft. How could I say anything, be anything, when all I wanted was to shelter him from the world? "You're not to blame for anything, Mia is just more outgoing, and it shouldn't matter," I replied weakly, desperately clawing for some reassurance in my own voice while he stared at me, waiting for real honesty. I wanted to tell him that I was scared of his loneliness, scared that he wouldn't fit into the world the way I hoped for him, that every snide remark from his peers killed a piece of my heart. "You know what, Mom? I just want to be me," came those fragile words, breaking through the air, and in that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. As he turned away and stared out the window, I was reminded of crisp autumn days, golden leaves spiraling silently to the earth, and suddenly I felt the weight of my own expectations crashing down like thunder. I'd wanted my son to be someone he's not. The thought lingered long after he left to find solace in his video games, an echo of realization that resonated deep within me. It wasn't Noah who needed to change, it was me that needed to stop placing blame and start nurturing the incredible person he was destined to become. I knew I had to repair the rift I had caused, but how? Days passed, and I crafted a plan, an emotional lifeline, something to counter the agony of that summer gathering. I realized that he needed not just an apology but a show of faith in his individuality. A camping trip, just the two of us, away from the chaos, was something he could take pride in. So I took him one Saturday, packed the car with sleeping bags and junk food, and we left our technology behind, just the two of us, under the vast canopy of stars. I watched as Noah pitched the tent, his confidence growing little by little with each step he took, and I felt something shift in the air. The weight of guilt was still there but backed by hope too. As we sat around the campfire, with the crackling flames dancing in our eyes, I told him everything, how proud I was of him, how much his uniqueness meant to me, how I should have encouraged him to be himself rather than lash out in frustration. His grin lit up the night, warming the chill away like the flames before us, and in that magic moment, I saw a spark of resilience flicker in his soul. I realized something immensely powerful. By letting him feel just a bit of the weight of the world, he took the first step towards overcoming it. A few weeks later, things had transformed slightly. Noah laughed louder, started to engage with new friends from school, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. It was as if my awful comments had forced a metamorphosis instead of breaking him, and as I watched him go through that new cycle of life, I knew I'd been wrong but that sometimes wrong turns can lead to unexpected growth. The barbecue wasn't the last. Family gatherings still echoed laughter just like that day did, but now I watched my son thrive instead of falter, and the cycle of hurt had turned into a cycle of healing, teaching him the resilience of the human spirit and that no matter what happens, coming back stronger is what truly matters. Amidst all that drama, amidst those blurted words and tearful evenings, there had emerged a tender understanding that formed deeper than any barrier, and while I may have blamed Noah, I realized it was just the gentle nudges of parenthood that pushed us both to be better versions of ourselves. In hauntingly beautiful ways, sometimes insensitivity can lead us to the love we really need. I should probably start by mentioning that my mom had always been a force of nature, a woman whose opinions could make or break the day. I used to look up to her, wanting to wear the same stylish clothes and have the same kind of confidence she exuded, but that changed after last year's family gathering when she casually mentioned I had gained weight over the winter. It wasn't said in a cruel way, but rather in her blunt, unyielding tone that left me reeling. At first, I thought about shrugging it off. After all, taste buds can drive the unwary to indulgence, but as weeks passed, I found myself trapping echoes of her words in the corners of my mind. Fast forward a few months later, we were preparing for my sister's wedding, a grand event that would showcase every family member and friend dressed to the nines. When my mom and I went dress shopping, I could feel anticipation buzzing in my veins, but it was bittersweet. Each dress was lovely, but as the sunlight grazed the mirror, it caught the fickle shadows of self-doubt, and every tug of fabric was accompanied by her scrutinizing gaze. Then came the moment I feared. She picked a stunning red dress and held it out like a trophy, but when I emerged from the dressing room, her reaction was not what I hoped for. "You know, honey, I think something a bit looser would suit you better," she said casually, her thin smile carrying an insidious weight. The words hung over me like a cloud threatening rain, and suddenly, all the mannequins seemed to close in around me, like they were whispering to each other. I felt the heat of shame creep through my cheeks, but something snapped. The soft, timid girl she had raised faded into the background as indignation bloomed. I stood there, heart pounding, and said, "AITA for telling Mom I will buy my own dress after she called me fat?" She blinked as if I had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face, and a shaky silence enveloped us. I turned my back, slipping back into the dressing room, and suddenly the chaos outside felt muffled, almost unreal. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. Why did I care what she thought? I rifled through the cheap dresses on the rack. The gaudy sequins and tearing seams felt welcoming in their imperfection. I tried on a simple emerald green gown that fit me like it was tailored just for me, and when I stepped back into the light, something shifted. The vision of the woman I used to be began to morph into something brand new, something brimming with defiance. I slid into the floor-length skirt, the color wrapping around me like a promise. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't just a girl burdened by her mother's words, it was a woman ready to make a statement, pursuing her independence, daring to redefine beauty on her own terms, and for the first time in a long while, I gasped with joy. I finally came to realize my worth was not tethered to the fabric my mother handed me, and as I walked back, the emerald dress swaying with each step, I could see the shift in her expression. Her eyes widened, a hint of surprise dancing in the corner of her mouth. That Actually looks lovely, she stammered, and something dark twisted in my gut, mingling anger and reluctant acceptance, as I remembered how her voice pierced through my happiness weeks ago. I shook my head, still feeling the rush of courage from leaving her disapproval behind as I answered, "Thanks, but I've decided I'll get my own dress for the wedding." The silence, thick and uncomfortable, tangled in the air between us as I could feel the tension coil tighter, her eyes flaring momentarily with disbelief before rolling into disappointment. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of disappointment in me bore down, and while I once sought her approval, this rejection tasted different. It felt like freedom. I floated to the store entrance, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, and when I bought the dress on my own terms, I felt like I was taking a bold step into the future instead of shying away from past shadows. Yet in the days leading up to the wedding, I could feel her gaze lingering, a cold prickling on my back as if she were waiting for the right moment to unleash her disappointment, and I braced myself as those wedding bells chimed. When the day finally came, I felt invincible as I pulled that emerald dress over my body, my reflection glowing with defiance. I triumphed through the crowd, my dad beaming with pride, yet behind me, I could sense my mom's silence. That characteristic sharpness in her smirk was nowhere to be found. As the vows exchanged resonated before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep down, spite lingered in that corner of her heart. Maybe she thought I'd regret standing up for myself, but as I took in the twinkling lights and the wild laughter around me, I knew I wouldn't take that confidence back for anything. The reception was euphoric until, just before it crescendoed, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She approached, and the air thickened as tension crackled between us. "You really should have let me help you pick something more flattering," she murmured, a thin smile resting on her face but a storm brewing in her expression. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the girl I used to be creeping back, whispering to shrink under her disdain, but I wasn't having it. Channeling everything I felt the moment I decided to reclaim my story, I stated firmly, "No, Mom. This is who I am, and if you can't support me, then maybe I was right to buy my own dress after all." She hesitated, an army of emotions flashing through her eyes, and in that moment, I saw both loss and fear mingling with something close to admiration. As the music filled the room and laughter broke around us, I felt the sharp edges of my insecurities dulling, transforming into an armor I never knew I needed. We could stand in the tension of our differences, or I could embrace the freedom that came with walking away from the need for her approval. I walked away from her then, joining my friends who were twirling joyfully under the fairy lights, a smile bursting anew as I danced beneath the stars, and while I could still feel her distant gaze, it didn't pierce through my newfound strength. It simply faded into the background, a reminder that sometimes, to find yourself, you must sever the chains holding you to hurtful expectations, and in that moment, I wasn't just wearing an emerald dress, I was wearing the knowledge that I was enough, just as I am. I never thought a simple time test could spiral into a living nightmare, but here we are, and I need to share what happened before it consumes me entirely. My husband, Aaron, has always been my biggest supporter, or at least that's what I believed until last week. With finals approaching, I dedicated a Saturday to prepare for my final exam, the kind worth a significant chunk of my grade. I set up in our small bedroom, a dimly lit space that was usually filled with warmth but felt claustrophobic under the pressure of looming deadlines. I had placed my phone on Do Not Disturb, drowning out the world, steeling my will against distractions, and I was well into a practice test when I heard the faint creaking of the door. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or a genuine sound breaking my concentration. I told myself I was just imagining it and pressed ahead. The clock was ticking, I could feel my heart rate sinking with its relentless countdown. Just as I reached a particularly tricky question, the door swung open wider than expected, and there stood Aaron, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't knock, he didn't even wait for me to acknowledge him. He simply walked in and, without a word, grabbed the empty coffee cup from my cluttered desk, which wouldn't have been a big deal under normal circumstances, but in that moment, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I exploded, shouting for him to get out and that I was in the middle of an important test. The look on his face morphed into confusion and hurt, making me feel worse almost instantly, yet a primal anger surged in me, an instinctive need to protect my focus at all costs, and I didn't realize I had crossed a line. Aaron backed away as if struck, retreating without another word, and I immediately regretted my outburst. It was never my intention to hurt him, but in the throes of tension, I was blind to everything else. Shaking, I tried to refocus, but the heaviness of my guilt loomed larger than any countdown timer. When I finally returned to the living room post-test, my heart sank deeper. The usually vibrant space felt hollow, too quiet, with tension hanging thick in the air. "Aaron?" I called hesitantly, my voice a small echo against the silence. No answer. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the spare room, but each corner of our home held only emptiness. Panic tightened my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to text him, but just as I was about to fire off a message, I noticed my notifications lighting up. The group chat with my classmates was flooded with frantic messages. "Did you hear about Aaron? I can't believe it, they were right near the corner." And then the most chilling of them all, they said his car is gone. My heart dropped as a gnawing realization settled in. They were talking about the car accident in the news, and my mind raced with desperate images of a twisted metal heap, my husband a possible victim, consequences of his day spiraling out of control for reasons I couldn't fathom. I raced to the living room TV, where a breaking news segment flickered to life, reporters framed by flashing lights, and there was Aaron's car smashed against a tree, completely unrecognizable. They were saying something about speed, a reckless driver, and I felt the world around me shatter anew with every word. Somehow, I remained stuck in my own head, trapped between the anger I felt moments earlier and the fear gripping me now, unable to disentangle from the chaos I had already created. It was my fault. I had shut him out during a moment of sheer panic, blinded by my own selfish needs. I dropped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as guilt twisted into a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't make it? What if my voice had been the last thing he heard? I couldn't bear the thought. I grabbed my things and raced out the door, my heart pounding like a war drum against my ribcage as I sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. Every red light felt like a ticking clock reminding me that I may have lost the only person who meant anything to me. When I finally made it to the ER, a haze of white coats and muffled voices surrounded me, and I stumbled onto a nurse who stopped me, her face a mask of professionalism that seemed utterly indifferent, and my gut twisted with urgency. "Please, where is he?" The nurse looked down and spoke carefully, almost as if she were preparing to shatter whatever shred of hope re-entered my heart. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. We're doing everything we can." I felt my heart drop into the depths of despair as the minutes turned into hours, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of my own actions. The waiting area morphed from an ordinary space into a suffocating chamber of dread where guilt gnawed at my insides, replaying our last moments together like a broken record. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared, and my soul practically leapt into my throat. "He's stable," she said cautiously, "but he's unconscious. You can see him, but..." She paused, and the world around me faded out for a moment. "It's serious." The words felt like ice as I walked into the stark hospital room, seeing Aaron there, hooked to machines, wires snaking around him, face bruised and battered. Reality collided with my trauma, crashing into me with violent force. I approached the bed, heart heavy with emotion, wishing I could take back everything, shouting, turning away. I gently took his hand, squeezing it tightly as if my life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, Aaron. I never wanted this. I had no idea how much I needed you until I almost lost you." Tears continued to flow freely as I sat there, whispering to him, pouring out all the love and regret that had built up inside me. As days turned into a week, the fragile threads of hope began to weave through the darkness, and Aaron slowly started to regain consciousness. The first time his eyes fluttered open, dread coursed through me. What would he say? Would he hate me? I couldn't face that possibility. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't remember the fight, praying my words had reached him somehow. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the harsh fluorescent lights before his gaze fell on me, bewilderment etched across his face. "What happened?" He managed to croak, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief mixed with dread as I prepared to answer. This moment felt pivotal, but in his eyes, I saw forgiveness, possibly a reflection of my own guilt. Maybe he could sense the crushing weight of my regret, or maybe it was just the haze of pain killing every harsh thought. All I could do was nod and squeeze his hand tighter, letting the tears flow. "You got into an accident," I said softly. "You're here now. Just focus on getting better." We had a long road ahead of us, and in that uncertain future lay the lessons of a nightmarish reality, one that had shaken our lives and reminded me of the fragility of every moment we take for granted. It's wild how quickly everything can change, how a simple act of frustration in an innocent moment can lead us to the brink before bringing us back in character-shattering ways. It was in those darkest hours that I realized it was never about the test, but rather the love and understanding we have to nurture. Life is too unpredictable. I vowed never to take him for granted again. So, am I the asshole for shouting at him during a timed test? I'm not sure if that label matters anymore. I never thought I'd be the type to make a mountain out of a molehill, but when I found myself standing in the doorframe of my boyfriend's apartment, my breath caught in my throat at the sight of his bed, cluttered and filthy, as though a tornado had swooped through and decided to make it the epicenter of chaos. Clothes were strewn everywhere, mostly crumpled t-shirts and socks that I was sure had grown sentient from the level of stagnation and odors wafting through the air, and the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. The stark contrast between the me who loved clean spaces and the him who seemed to revel in squalor became almost unbearable. I tried to mask my discomfort with a laugh, joking about how he was practically living in a pigsty, but deep down, the thought of laying in that unkempt space made my skin crawl. He just smiled back, oblivious, as he plopped onto the mattress, inviting me to join him. I hesitated, my mind racing with visions of all the microscopic horrors that could be lurking within that unclean sanctuary. "Are you serious?" I finally said, my voice rising slightly in disbelief. "I can't sleep in that thing." He frowned, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger, perhaps? Disappointment. I couldn't pin it down, but the mood shifted like the flicker of a candle just before it extinguishes. I backed away, shaking my head. "You need to clean up. I'm not going to sleep on whatever that is." He stood up, the disappointment morphing into something darker, like the thunderclouds gathering on the horizon. "Well, if you can't handle it," he spat, "maybe you don't deserve to be here at all." It felt like a slap to the face, and for a moment, hurt washed over me, replaced quickly by anger. "It's not about deserving, it's about hygiene. I thought you cared about your living space." But he glared at me as though I had just insulted a sacred relic, and I felt the tension coil into something like a visible entity between us. I was taken aback by the ferocity of his reaction, not having realized then just how deep the roots of his attachment to that mess went. He stormed past me, slamming a door I didn't even see behind him, and I took a shaky breath, stepping back out into the hall, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere. I hesitated, wondering if I was being unreasonable, but I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I left his apartment and drove home, feeling the betrayal of the moment like a heavy fog suffocating my thoughts. Days passed without a word between us, and the silence was deafening. I kept replaying our argument in my head, trying to convince myself that I was justified in refusing to sleep in what felt like a den of filth, but my conscience was riddled with guilt. Just when I thought the tension would become unbearable, he reached out to me, sending a simple "I miss you." My heart flipped, and I immediately replied, arranging a dinner where we could sort everything out. But as I pulled into the parking lot, an unsettling chill crept down my spine, as though I were stepping into the lion's den armed only with my feeble attempts at diplomacy. I could see him waiting by the entrance, but this time, the usual warmth was replaced with a tension that twisted at my gut. "Let's talk in my apartment," he suggested, his voice eerily casual, too casual for how I felt. As we entered, I held my breath, bracing for the chaos of his lair, only to find it surprisingly clean. The bed was made, and the floor was swept. It felt almost alien in its transformation, but I was still cautious. "What happened?" I managed, crossing my arms defensively. "I cleaned up," he replied, wearing a smug grin. But the jovial tone in his voice fell flat as I noticed the strange glint in his eyes, something sinister lurking behind that practiced smile. I glanced around, uneasy, and sat on the edge of the couch rather than risking proximity to that once abominable bed. Over dinner, which he insisted on preparing himself, my unease only grew. The clattering of forks felt haunting, and as he spoke, I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I asked him about his sudden change in attitude, but the conversation felt forced, flitting over other topics and distractions. By the time we finished eating, I was ready to leave, but he broached a topic that sent chills straight to my core. "So, about my bed," he said, leaning closer, his eyes holding mine in an unwavering grip. "You know I've always wanted to share that space with you. It means a lot to me." I felt a knot of dread seize my stomach. "You want me to sleep in that bed?" I shook my head, caution flaring in me. You have to understand, I can't. I can't just forget what it was like. That's not just about cleanliness, it feels. I hesitated, looking for the right word. It felt unsafe. The smile vanished from his lips, replaced by something cold and deadly, and suddenly I could see that glint in his eyes morph into a shadow that seemed to envelop both of us. Do you not trust me? His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, a threat sliding between the words, and I stumbled back, feeling a claustrophobic weight surround me. I started, trying to express the tangled mess of my thoughts, but the air became thick with an unsettling silence until he stood in front of me. You never even tried to understand, he said quietly, his voice almost soothing as fear clawed at my insides. He took a step closer, and instinctively I stepped back. Did you ever think that maybe the mess was a part of me? I shook my head vigorously, trying to form a coherent response, but the walls felt like they were closing in, the space suddenly becoming intimate in the worst possible way. I tried, I shouted, desperation clawing through my voice as he moved to block the exit, his expression shifting between puzzlement and anger. I tried to understand, but there's a limit. I can't just ignore the feeling. Feeling? He echoed, voice dripping with mockery. Why is it that you get to dictate what I am allowed to feel? At this point, I knew I was in true danger. He was unraveling in front of me, the shape of the man I knew becoming something unfamiliar, grotesque. The fear urged me to scream, but I held it back, not wanting to escalate the situation. I pivoted, darting towards the kitchen and grabbing my phone, my only tether to the outside world. In one swift motion, I dialed for help, praying the police would pick up, but the second he realized what I was doing, I felt his hot breath against my neck. You think you can get away that easily? You think calling someone is going to save you now? I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a war drum accompanied by visions of the boy I once loved morphing into something menacing. You don't want to do this, I managed, my voice shaky. I'm leaving. You're not going anywhere, he hissed, and at that moment, the facade shattered completely, the man I had once cared for replaced by a creature I barely recognized. I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, heart racing as I searched for an escape route. I thought we could share everything. His voice rang hollow, eyes dark, almost cavernous. I dashed towards the back door just as he lunged at me, his fingertips brushing the skin of my arm which felt like ice against my skin. I tore away from him, throwing open the door, sprinting into the night. My lungs burned as I ran, hearing him scream behind me, a sound so primal and furious that it sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, drowning out the audio of my panicked breaths. I didn't stop until I reached my car, nearly collapsing as I scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me like it could shield me from the chaos. My phone buzzed frantically in my pocket as I dialed the police for the second time, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened, the dispatcher's calm voice a lifeline in the storm. I kept glancing back at the apartment, haunted by the fear of him emerging once again, wishing I had never walked into that filthy sanctuary of his, wishing I had never dismissed my instincts. I was shaken to my core, and though I never thought I'd become someone who would rely on outward appearances to judge character, those first moments of discomfort rang alarmingly clear in my memory. A few officers arrived within minutes, breaking down the door only for it to reveal an untouched space. They found nothing, no sign of violence, no clues, but when they turned to me, concern etched on their faces, I realized that the thing that had terrified me most wasn't the dirt or the mess. It was what had been buried underneath, something festering and idle, a reflection of a darkness that came from the very mind of the man I once loved. And as the adrenaline faded and reality settled back in, I couldn't shake the chilling thought that I had narrowly escaped a fate that could have been so much worse, all because I had refused to share a dirty bed. AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation? It started as a simple family trip to a cabin in the woods, a chance for my kids to unwind before school started again, but everything changed when my sister's son, Jamie, was mentioned. I hadn't seen him in a while. His mother, Sarah, had become reclusive since her divorce, her walls tightening around her like a fortress. The last time we were together, Jamie was a sweet, albeit awkward, 12-year-old. You'd think his 16th birthday would have matured him, but he felt different somehow, more distant and brooding. Sarah texted me a week before we left, pleading me to take him. He needs family, she wrote, her words laced with desperation. I hesitated. Jamie had started to linger around the edges of social media, posting pictures that hinted at a fascination with dark themes, and I've always been the protective type, especially when it concerns my kids. Just days before the trip, I finally responded, "He can stay with you, we're looking for a low-key vacation." I thought that would be the end of it. But on the day we left, I caught my sister's expression when she saw my kids loaded into the car, a mix of hope and dread that twisted something inside me. They waved goodbye, and Jamie's eyes, oh God, those eyes, held such a haunting intensity, a storm of emotions boiling just beneath the surface. I could barely sleep in the cabin, the walls creaked unnervingly at night, and I kept hearing whispers, low and slithering like a snake through the air, but I tried to shake it off, just the house settling, I told myself. On the second evening, while the kids roasted marshmallows outside, I found an old scrapbook tucked beneath one of the beds in our room. The pages were yellowed and curling, filled with grainy photographs of children. I flipped through and my stomach dropped at the sight. Jamie was in some of them, looking eerily out of place, and the other kids, they looked off, like something dark was seeping from their smiles, their eyes too hollow. My headache worsened, shadows seemed to twist into figures in the periphery, and I could have sworn I heard breathing whenever I turned my back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had known something before she packed Jamie off. That night, my children were restless, they tossed and turned, sleep eluding them, and at one point, my youngest, Lily, woke me up, wide-eyed and terrified, whispering of a man in the woods who stared at her from behind the trees. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an imagination lit by the flickering firelight, but I couldn't help but feel an ominous presence lurking beyond our campfire. The following day, I decided to take a hike with the kids to dispel the uneasy feeling hanging over us. As we wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed a tree carved with strange symbols, things that twisted my stomach and made my heart race, symbols that hinted at something ritualistic, dark. Lily, transfixed, wanted to touch the bark, but I pulled her away just in time, the feeling of dread coiling tighter around my mind. That evening, the message came through. Sarah was frantic, texting me nonstop, telling me Jamie had gone missing. My heart dropped, panic crashing over me. I quickly attempted to reassure her. Of course we hadn't invited him to the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more involved in the panic than I realized. Something whispered that we were wrong to leave him behind. The next few days blurred, another night passed, and I heard scratching at the walls, voices calling to me and childlike laughter, and when I stepped outside, I was hit by an unbearable chill. The woods felt alive, breathing, twisting in ways nature shouldn't, a cacophony of whispers beckoning me, saying come play with us. On the fourth day, the atmosphere shifted entirely. My kids began acting differently, more aggressive, thick-lipped smiles stretching beyond the realm of normalcy, their eyes bearing an unnatural light that chilled my spine. "Where's Jamie?" they asked over and over, speaking of him as if he had always been with them. I felt sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I tried to wrangle them away from the shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing hour, and finally, I gathered the courage to venture deeper into the forest alone, driven by an instinct to find Jamie. As I stepped through the trees, whispers became a chorus, begging me to stay, luring me deeper until I stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the center, was a figure dressed in dark clothes, a silhouette of Jamie, but he looked older, almost feral, eyes shrouded in shadow, the edge of his smile vivid against hollow cheeks. My breath hitched as he turned, revealing teeth sharp as knives and an unnatural grin far too wide for his face. "I've been waiting for you," he hissed, his voice crawling beneath my skin, splintering the quiet like thunder. The shadows danced around him, and as they flickered, I felt a wrenching pull inside of me, and as if the woods had conspired, my kids burst into the clearing, eyes glowing, voices harmonizing with Jamie's as they called me to join them. Then came the sound, like a collective heartbeat, an echo of every kid that ever disappeared in those woods. I turned to run, but the shadows wrapped around my legs, their laughter curling around me, pulling me into their realm. And just as I felt myself slipping into the abyss, a sudden thought shattered through the haze: AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. As that realization hit, this strange bond washed over me. I knew that in denying his invited presence, I had awakened something that should have remained dormant. I stumbled back, gasping, pushing against the tangible dark that swirled around me until I finally broke free, tumbling back toward the safety of our cabin, heart racing, mind screaming. I shut the door, locking it tight, a desperate barricade against the voices. I ordered my children to get their things. We're leaving. I didn't care what they thought. I glanced back at the woods, Jamie standing at the edge, a devilish allure flickering in his darkened figure, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel his gaze burning into my back, burning with the knowledge that every year my sister kept him from us, every vacation we had without him, every time we let the shadows whisper, I was sealing not just my fate, but his legacy, a legacy rising from the depths of the forest where children disappear without a trace, where families fall captive, and in that darkness, a voice would always echo, a question reverberating in the silence. AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know, stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shed0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shed0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies, a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper, I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. "It's important you meet me," it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. "You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here," he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. "You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away," I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. "They don't belong to you," he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang, eyes wide. I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up, a tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity, my husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. "It's just a dog," he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus, my unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the lights stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. AITA. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes.